was a subculture of the overall squadron that had some of the very same problems. And a lot of squadrons in the Air Force today have this problem, where we get the job done despite diminished resources, despite maybe unprepared leaders. We still get the job done. People have pride in what they do. We're skilled in what we do. So the mission gets done, but there's lots of areas for improvement, for effectiveness. So I'm Jason Newcomer. This is Dan Connolly. And one of the things we want to give you today is maybe something to add to your toolkit to take back with you. How many folks in here are graduated squadron commanders already? Nobody? Wow, 1, 2, 3. Okay, so a small handful. That's great. So in the lab this morning, we had several students that were in there, about 33 students in my lab, and there were only 2 graduated commanders, and those commanders both said that they got benefit out of the lab. So hopefully you'll get some benefit out of this as well. There were 30 commanders that we interviewed to do this research, and the goal was to identify best practices for squadron commanders out of their experience, because you can see from the bios, I've not been a squadron commander yet. Hopefully that's next in my future. Dan has not been a squadron commander yet, and he won't be at this point, obviously. And so what we got was the experiences from graduated commanders that have already been there, and that's good because I don't have any command experience to bias the results of the research. Dan didn't have any experiences to bias the results of the research. So what we learned were the raw experiences of 30 different commanders, and we were able to take those experiences and compare them and find out things that worked no matter what the background was. So why is that important? So this board fellow up here has the world record for the largest house of cards ever built. If this were the Air Force, which functions sort of like a house of cards, with the squadrons being the basic building blocks according to the AFI 38101, then the squadron will be right about here, which means that you guys are here, and then wood is right there, if this were the Air Force. That's important to understand that, because the chief has harped on this, our AFI has harped on this, and everybody in here has been at the squadron level and knows that that is where the training happens. That's where we really organize, train, and equip our troops. That's where the mission happens. That's where the development happens. Even at the squadron commander level, this is where officers who are being groomed to be senior officers succeed and fail at command to learn what it's like to command. And so the squadron is critical. Here's a breakdown of our squadron commanders. The top row and the bottom row are not connected. So the top row is the breakout of mission area. So out of the 30 commanders, you can see there were 5 that were in operations, 2 hybrids, a training squadron commander, some mission support, maintenance, and medical. That's kind of the breakout. And the intent was to make sure that we had a diverse population, because again, we wanted to make sure that the results that we gleaned out of the research would be results that are generalizable to commanders, period, not operations commanders or support commanders or medical commanders. We wanted to provide something back to the Air Force that folks could use no matter what your skill sets were. And then these things go beyond commanders. These are leadership practices that you'll see in a second that can tie into first sergeants, superintendents, flight commanders, things that you can work on as you're grooming up throughout your career. On the bottom row, you'll see that there are different MAJCOMs to show the diversity of the Air Force, because right now, every MAJCOM hosts their own squadron commanders course. So each command experience in a different MAJCOM may be different from one MAJCOM to the next. So the intent here was to make sure that we had a diverse population of functional areas and a diverse population of MAJCOM command experiences. That way, when we start to see emerging themes come out during the research, we know that these things they transcend your functional area or the MAJCOM where you experience your command, or where these folks experience command. So in organizational leadership, there's plenty of different models. There's a 10-star organizational leadership model that looks at 10 different elements of leadership. We used that model and pulled out 3 of them that were not relevant to the squadron level. There were some for strategic planning at the headquarters level. There were some for leadership development at the headquarters level, things that Air Force A1DI does with the development teams and vectoring and things like that don't necessarily apply to the squadron. So we distilled it down to the 7 elements that actually apply to a squadron level commander, things that you can influence or things that influence you and your organization, and we focused on that during the research. Spend a few quick seconds just touching on these. That way, as we go throughout the rest of the presentation, you understand what we mean by leadership. So we looked at leadership. We were looking at the leadership team. The leadership team varies based on the squadron of the commander that we interviewed. Some squadrons were smaller and some were larger. Some had DOs and ADOs, Assistant Director of Operations. Some had first sergeants, some didn't have a first sergeant, some had chiefs and superintendents, and some didn't have that, and some squadrons relied heavily on their CNCOs as part of the Corps, and some did not. But whatever that leadership team was, the effectiveness of that team and why they were or were not effective is what we focused on in this research. For training, those were things like the organizational, your 797 training, your local tasks, ancillary training, anything, mission qualification training, anything that for that squadron represented preparing the airmen in that unit to accomplish the mission. That was the training piece that we focused on there. For customer service, every unit in the Air Force provides some sort of value as an output to accomplish the overall higher level missions. So that value and the organization or people receiving that value that your organization puts out, how you transfer that value to the customer, that is the customer service piece that we focused on. So if it was something like a finance, if it was a comptroller squadron or a contracting squadron, it's a little easier to see what customer service means there. For operational squadrons, it's a little different because if you're a mobility squadron, depending on who your customer is, it could be somebody downrange, or if you're a fighter squadron, same thing. So it just depends on the squadron, but they all have customer service and they all have some sort of value they put out. Performance improvement, that one was basically how you motivate airmen in your organization to change behavior to something that's more desirable to accomplish your goals. And that's how we frame that as a commander. So there's lots of ways to do that, right? We have awards programs, we have non-judicial punishment, we have counseling, mentoring, development. There's all kinds of ways to execute performance improvement. That's what we're talking about when we hit that. Communication is how you communicate messages across people in an organization. So basic communication definition there, not a lot needed. Employee relations, these are those interactions between the unit that touches on a little more of the things like the unit climate assessment type of stuff, the way the morale was in the unit, the way people interacted with each other, how involved were people with the booster club and different squadron events, and how did that influence effectively accomplishing the organizational goals. And then the last one we touched on was change management. And change management was one of those things, actually Todd Henry, who spoke here yesterday, he talked about, when he was talking about, he had a quad chart that was up there and it talked about challenge versus stability. You folks remember that? And with stability and challenge, if you execute change management properly, the stability doesn't really change much and the challenge stays the same, so you'll have folks that are thriving. But if you don't, if you don't have that executed change management properly, then you'll be on the other end. And I think the two that he had there, the one was lost in the bottom left with low challenge and low stability, and the top left was anger. So they're angry. So you'll have folks that are challenged but not stable and are angry, or you'll have folks that are not challenged and not stable and they're lost. And I'm sure some folks in the room may have seen that with reorganizations or changes in the organization when things weren't broadcast properly. So that's why that was an important area to hit as well. So these areas are themes. These are the overarching areas that we are getting data from the participants to feed back into. Looking at the themes, this is what we found. Probably doesn't make a lot of sense to folks right now. So we're going to dig into this a little bit and see what this means. So in the blue, you'll see those themes that I just covered, those 7 different areas of organizational effectiveness. In the gray, you'll see what we call nodes. And I'm going to dig into that a little bit. This is how we get nodes. Anybody read that? No? So the nodes, these are the 30 interviews that we conducted. So you'll see each row of colors. Each row signifies one interview. So these lasted about an hour and a half. And so the first column would be leadership, team effectiveness. The second column would be training, then customer service. So each participants and what they said about each area. So we took that information, and you'll see comments. They rated it a 1 through 5, and the color will signify how they felt about their effectiveness in that area. How effective was your leadership team as you were running your squadron? And you'll see based on the colors, there's some reds, some greens, some yellows, and some oranges. So some commanders said they did well in that area, others didn't. And there were various reasons for that we'll touch on in a little bit here. But here's the kind of things that we get, the kind of detailed feedback they provide. So each one of those blocks is detailed feedback from the interview. So we took all those blocks and we compared them across the line, and you'll get something that looks a little bit like this. And I know it's hard to see. The intent is not that you can necessarily read this in detail. But when you generalize those comments down, for example, one commander might have said that I had a squadron DO that was a first lieutenant because we didn't have the resources for me to get in a captain or somebody else that was more appropriate. So they were not as effective as a leadership team because that commander did not have the right skill set to execute the mission. Other commanders may have been gapping a DO, or other commanders might have had a great chief master sergeant or a great DO. In general, what they were saying is that the strength of that leadership team impacted the effectiveness of them to lead their squadron. And so when you narrow it down, that's what these nodes up here are, the narrowed down comments about, in general, whether it's positive or negative, what are they really trying to say about how this node impacted the unit. So when you do that, you start to see nodes that are not just in one column, but in multiple columns. And when you get nodes in multiple columns, that's where you get the chart that I showed you before, and Dr. Connolly will cover that in a little bit here. Right now, I want to focus on the actual individual columns. So what do we see in each column? So under leadership, some of the things, and there were, you saw the list, there are a lot of different nodes that we got out of this. Commanders, they were very generous with their time. There was so much in the research that I actually feel I did a disservice by not being able to get it all into the paper. But what I'm going to give to you are the top nodes. And here's the first one. So the leadership team strength impact equality. And I touched on this a little bit already, whether the folks had the right people in place. General Quast talked about that yesterday as far as having the right people and how much of a difference that makes. Some of this stuff you can control and some of you can't. A lot of it you can't control. A lot of squadron commanders can't control their squadron DO. You get who you get. Your first sergeant, you get who you get. Your chief. So in a lot of cases, you cannot control this. You'll have to try to mitigate that. But this was one of the biggest factors, this was the biggest factor that impacted the leadership team effectiveness, is the team strength based on the personality interactions or the capabilities of the leadership, whether it be the flight commanders, the DO, the SHIRT, the superintendent, the senior civilian, or the commander. And that was the biggest thing there. Second was commander said they struggled with focusing on strategic tasks versus fighting fires. Another thing that General Quast spoke on yesterday, as far as if you have to micromanage everything, then you're not doing your job right. The commanders who struggled with this said that they felt like they did micromanage, and they felt like they had to because they didn't have the right people in place. The commanders who made positive comments reference the same node said that they had a staff that they could delegate, and they were able to push things down to, didn't have to micromanage, so they were able to focus on the strategic tasks, the things that only a commander can do. The things only a commander can sign, the decisions only a commander can make. Those, in a perfect world, based on these commanders' interviews, those are the things that you should be doing as a commander to maximize your effectiveness, is only the things that you can do. And everything else can be pushed down to the appropriate staff if you have the right folks. For training, training is one of those areas that throughout our careers we've all seen training diminished in some case. We've seen that training doesn't necessarily always get the attention that it should. I actually had my flight command tour in a training squadron, very resource limited. Things always seem to be reactive instead of proactive to get training where it needed to be. And so this is one of the areas to where commanders who made training a priority in their unit saw that their training programs were more effective, their mission accomplishment was more effective, and by being proactive and looking at training in advance, they were able to mitigate problems in the future when resources weren't quite as good as they wanted. They've already taken care of those pieces because training was always a priority. And then realistic training was another big one. So a lot of commanders during these interviews, they shunned the CBTs. It's great that our Secretary-in-Chief right now are getting after reducing the amount of ancillary training and CBTs and additional duties. They're not going to go away entirely, but the biggest thing was use realistic training. And this comes for deployments and other things. There were commanders that were actually, to get their folks ready to perform in a deployed environment, they were actually setting up bare-base tents on the base and making them work out of the tents for small periods of time just to get them used to operating in that manner, just to make sure that besides the CBTs, the SEER training and all that stuff, they can actually, when they deploy, they know they'll be able to accomplish the mission. Customer service. So customers were a priority. Depending on the type of wing and the type of mission set that you have, you will likely have various customers with various requirements, whether it be they're 24-hour ops, or they have weird deployment times or special needs for special customers. It's hard to develop processes that work for everybody. So the commanders that spoke about being effective in these areas, they were the commanders that said they took the time to specialize processes and tailor their processes in their unit to find a way to get the yes, to make the mission, to meet the needs of the customers, versus making it easy for them, standardized training, this is our process, you fit into this as the customer. Instead, they would tailor outside of that. Tying to that, to be able to do that, they talked about inter-unit relationships. Now, everybody got the book in their leadership class, Real. John Swatell, who spoke yesterday, he published a book called Real. And in that book, there are effective leadership practices in one of the pages there, about the middle of the book. And one of them is investing in relationships. And so these commanders echoed what John put in his book about investing in relationships, but instead of investing in personal relationships, the commanders were investing in organizational relationships across the base, talking to other commanders, figuring out what are your needs, especially like in fields like contracting. Okay, so what does this equipment do for you so I can help make the argument and sell this better to get you what you need to do your job? So those interorganizational relationships are extremely important in that aspect. For performance improvement, awards programs was the biggest piece. And this is not just having an awards program. A lot of the commanders that I spoke to, they actually did not have a solid awards program when they walked into the unit. A lot of them walked into a unit that had a defunct awards program, and they had to put a lot of effort into repairing the program. And once they did, they saw positive results come out of that. Some of the things, not just nominating the right people for the awards, but also not nominating the wrong people. Because right now we have that mentality, you know, hey, it was your turn last month, it's this person's turn next month, and we've seen that in different units, and everybody handles it a little differently. But when you do that, if you take turns with awards, and if you hand out awards to folks that don't deserve it, these commanders were identifying that had drastically negative effects on the unit morale. And they were a lot more effective when they held high standards and rewarded the people who met those high standards during the tenure of their command. So with the setting high standards, one of the things that they mentioned is a lot of times they would come into units that struggled with this. That, you know, we have the Air Force, my opinion, and my wing commander's watching this, so I'm probably getting in trouble for this, but I feel like the Air Force is a mediocrity. The Air Force is an organization right now, and General Quast kind of talked about this a little bit yesterday too. We're very risk averse. We focus on staying within the lines, and if you do well within the lines and you don't take risk and you push that limit there without going outside the boundaries, then you do well. That's a mediocrity. When you don't take risk and you don't take the chance and go above and beyond, then you're in an organization that's a mediocrity. And when you have mediocrity, it's hard to set people to high standards and give people, because you have to give them freedom to mess up when you set them to those standards. So the commanders who did that, even in units that didn't necessarily have high standards, said that the people in the units adapted to their leadership style and they started living up to the high standards. There were folks that had to be disciplined. There were some corrective actions. It's not easy, or you're not going to walk in and just repair a broken organization. But when you go through the work up front, in the end, you have an organization that starts to run itself, and you no longer have to worry about all that continued effort that you would put in an otherwise average organization throughout the tenure of your command. And then effectively managing talent. So General Quast mentioned this yesterday as well. A little different approach, right? Because we don't have a lot of flexibility to hire and fire folks that we'd like to. But within the talent that you have, I feel like General Quast looked at my manuscript and stole some of my stuff for his brief. But with the things that are in your control, you can manage the talent that you have in your unit. So when you have a project, you know who the superior performers are, the ones that you can give that project and get executed. You know the developmental performers, the ones who are, I had a commander that talked about Indy cars and stock cars in the organization. He said, you know, in every organization you'll have about 10% of Indy cars and you'll have 90% stock cars. And you have to know how to use the Indy cars, and you have to use them and then use the Indy cars to help develop some of the stock cars and ramp them up. And so that's what this is. This is knowing who you have and putting the right people in the right places, and also removing the right people from the right places. And I don't have to go too much into that because, like I said, General Quast already hit on that yesterday. And along the same lines is where I was going to go with this brief, as far as there's folks that underperform, and it's more effective for you to go through the effort and remove those people than it is to let them stay and try to work through it and try to be nice. And that was it's the same message General Quast said yesterday based on his experience, is the exact same feedback these commanders were giving during their interviews. It's better just to address the issue, good or bad. Change management we talked about earlier. communicating regularly is extremely important in change management. And you'll see when Dr. Connolly gets up here that communication is one of those nodes that impacts multiple themes. So regular communication, what does that mean? A lot of commanders emphasize the need that no matter how clear they thought a message was, it was misinterpreted by the time it got out to the unit. So they made it a point to say it at a commander's call. They made it a point to say it again. They sent out an email. They'll repeat what they sent out at the commander's call. And then when they're walking around, which we'll get to in a little bit, they would say it again, just to make sure that people clearly understood the message and help control the rumor mill, especially when it comes to change. Speaking of controlling rumor mill, that's where the transparency piece comes in. So when you communicate, especially during change management, people in a lot of cases are nervous or anxious because they realize that as the organization changes, their role in the organization changes. And the dynamic changes based on the unit. Right now, I'm in a unit that has probably 70% civilians or contractors in it. So when you make an organizational change, civilians have core docs that put them in certain roles. They have pay grades that are based on how many people they supervise. And so when you change an organization, it's not just as simple as, hey, this is more effective, I'm going to change this, so we're going to do it. This requires being transparent, communicating up and down the chain to make sure that the changes you're going to make and the impacts that those changes are going to have are clearly understood by everybody in the organization. And if you don't do that, when changes or reorgs are made in a vacuum, then that's when you go back to what Todd talked about yesterday, where you have the anger or the people who are lost because they don't know what's going on or why it's happening. Which ties us into the airmen need to understand their role in the big picture. They need to understand how they fit into the process, how they fit in not only the change process, but in the new organization and what that's going to look like. Like I said, I mentioned some flight commander stuff. I mentioned the civilians. When you reorg an organization, how is that going to impact the civilians? They're going to have the union rights, and they're going to talk about that. They're going to have maybe pay grade changes, and so you need to make sure you address all those things and that everyone understand where they're going to be when this change takes place. That all falls into communication as well. So for communication piece, leadership by walking around was the biggest in the whole study. This was the most common theme across all the commanders: is get out of your office. And a lot of us have heard that already. But as I've gone through my career, I've seen this not happen, no matter how much we've heard about it. And nothing I'm putting up here, nothing that you're going to see in these notes, none of it's rocket science. It's all things that we may have heard at one point or another. But knowing that collectively these things have a certain impact is hopefully going to provide some kind of value back to you. And especially when Dr. Connolly gets up here and talks about limited time and how you can work some of these things together, that's really going to hopefully provide you some value back. So the leadership by walking around piece, that's extremely important. We all know what that means, to get out from your desk, walk around, meet the folks, learn what their issues are, get integrated, build trust by being present. And when you do that, then you will start to get feedback, not just down, but you'll get the feedback up and be able to make more informed decisions. Now, one of the things to be aware of as you do this, it's funny for us as officers to walk around and not realize the impact we're having while we do that. Just last week, I was back in our radar evaluation section, and we have 2 different programs that we support. And the folks for the programs, the NCOIC sat on 2 different sides of the cubicle room. But the airmen that are the radar evaluation technicians, they were mixed all around the room, and the NCOICs knew which people worked for them. And so it was just one of those things to where they wanted folks to have flexibility to sit where they want. They knew who their people were, and they wanted to have that freedom in their work center. And that's fine. I had no issue with that. I asked about it because it was curious to me. Like I saw one person working on a program. I was like, oh, I thought you were in JSS, and those guys are over there. And the master sergeant was like, no, sir, they just sit all over the place, and it's all right. I was like, okay, no worries. So I went back on Friday before I left to come here for this TDY, and everybody's moved. And so I went back and I was like, so did you guys move? Did you want a window seat? And there's like, no, sir, we had to move to be realigned with our functional areas. I was like, really? And I looked over at one of the tech sergeants. So the master sergeant's out, hopefully not watching this video. I looked at one of his tech sergeants, like, so was this because I asked a question about it a couple days ago? He goes, yes, sir, you did this to us. I said, all right, good to know, thanks. It was not my intention, but I hope you like your new seating. So one of the pitfalls of walking around, right? Try not to get too involved, and even something as simple as asking a question can turn into a task or somebody move around. Open door policy. This was an interesting one because not all commanders had the same type of open door policy. I didn't realize there's different types of open door policies until I spoke to these folks. But there were some commanders, like my current commander actually has a very open door policy. There should be ranges on this, right? Like open door, very open door, no door. So my commander right now probably has a no door policy, right? So anybody has the flexibility to walk in and talk with him when they need to, and he'll always make the time. We have a small squadron. We have about 84 people in our squadron. There are some squadrons, some of the commanders that I talk to, that have large squadrons, 500 people, 350 people. Can't have a no-door policy in most cases with 350 people in your unit. So you have to put on some restrictions for the type of things and the level of, after you've reached failure at so many points in your chain of command trying to work something out, now you can come into my door. So based on where you go for your command experience, that unit size, the size of your unit, is going to determine what kind of open door policy you may have. And that's interesting because we'll talk about unit size in a little bit here as well, which is right there. So unit size does matter. So small units and large units experience different dynamics in the organizational culture. You'll see this in communication. You'll see it with training. And so that's the two areas where it's going to pop up. Larger units, if you have a commander's call and you're a security forces squadron commander with 300 folks, you're not having one commander's call. You're having 2 or 3 commander's calls. You're probably having them more frequently. You're going out and doing post visits. If you are a contracting squadron commander, you're probably having one commander's call in your conference room with your whole squadron right there. Depending on the size of your squadron, that's going to impact the ease of communicating messages, the frequency that you have to visit things, the level of information or type of information that's going to make its way up to you as the commander. In a small squadron, it's going to be easier to stay connected to your airmen. As you move into a bigger squadron or take command of a larger unit, it's going to be a lot more difficult. And this applies for first sergeants, applies for flight commanders with big flights versus small flights. Same concepts apply no matter what your role is, whether you're officer or enlisted. The size of your unit is going to impact the effectiveness of communication. And the larger the unit, the more difficult it's going to be to communicate messages and receive feedback. So there's something to be aware of. And then lastly, there was only one major theme under employee relations, and that was a policy to outline respect. This is what, I know I'm probably going to get darts thrown at me, but this is what I like about the Green Dot program. I don't like the frequency of Green Dot training, but I think the concept behind Green Dot is a fantastic concept, because Green Dot really, when you think about it, it's about mutual respect and creating a culture where people respect one another. When you have that, you have a culture that has trust, and you have a culture that communicates and is more effective. So commanders, the biggest thing under employee relations, how they integrate, was making sure that commanders had a policy and that they enforced mutual respect amongst people in the unit. There were also things mentioned about morale and whatnot, but that was not the biggest factor in here. So the biggest one there was a policy to outline respect. So I wanted to hit those nodes and themes real quick. That way, as Dr. Conley gets up here and starts talking a little bit about the relationships between those nodes that are in gray and those themes that are in blue, you can understand how this helps you maximize what I just told you about this laundry list of things that work in different areas to be effective as a commander and maximize your time. So without further ado, I turn the floor over to my colleague and friend, Dan Conley.
Jason, thanks a lot. Can you all hear me okay? Nice. I need the clicker, man. Thank you. I don't think Jason mentioned, by the way, that his military call sign is BS. You've heard from Major Newcomer about the purpose and method of the study and some information about the findings. It's my task now to help you see more of the work's practical significance for you. Also be mindful that the full paper comes out in the spring issue of Air and Space Power Journal. So you get to see more of this there. First, the direction of the arrows on the chart that Jason developed bears some closer examination. For example, let's take a look at the correlated input of those 30 interviews, specifically in the lower left of the chart. And the indication here is that if you want to improve training and customer service, that the thing you actually want to identify for action and emphasis is resources. So trying to improve these areas on the front end without a lot of attention to resources behind the lines might actually be counterproductive. And that's something that you can pick up from the direction of the arrows. Second, the most vital factors in turning around a squadron or improving its performance may not be things that we would at first put on the tops of our lists. But these 30 commanders did after they had experienced successes and failures in the job. So the next few slides we have are going to tell more of that story. Realize that part of the reason for the importance of resources implied in these interviews, it may be the morale enhancement of personnel performing training, customer service, or interaction with other units because they are being resourced. The raw data also hinted that more investment in training predicted better customer service. So what you get here for a commander is opportunity. What this means, essentially, if it's accurate, is that highly emphasizing training might be a way for commanders, who, as we know, can't be everywhere, can actually better control those interactions with customers and other units. Okay, in addition to the findings that we had on the importance of resources, commanders highlighted how the pace of operations deeply affected training and communication within the unit. Basically, around-the-clock operations hurt these squadron functions. Training suffered in quality and in the results of training, particularly as consistent training and standardization across all shifts became more important depending on the squadron mission. So in settings with 24-hour ops, communication within the unit suffered even more, blunting the effects of tools that we would often rely on, such as commanders' calls and leadership presence. Our research suggested that countering those training challenges in units with those kind of operations, commanders that succeeded put even more resources into training. Okay, multiple times we saw the comm issue haunting commanders, especially with a faster pace of operations. We heard regret when day-to-day details took over and took away the attention and the time of the commander. And this process of being distracted from the comm problem saw those day-to-day problems only increase in scale and importance over time. So actually the commander is being hurt twice. Okay, first being distracted, and second, the day-to-day problems did not get effectively addressed over time. Now, turning to another topic, our data also addressed the practice, as Jason mentioned, of leadership by walking around. Okay, as Jason mentioned, this is hardly a new idea, we know that. But a good question to ask is, why does it work, right? Two more good questions. Okay, how do I maximize its value with limited time? And then finally, when I feel like I need to skip it, what am I risking? Well, the interviews revealed the power of this practice. Visibility and availability clearly make a difference. We could figure that one out. But the data also suggested that subordinates' faith improved because of this practice of leadership by walking around. Faith in the commander and faith in the future. Of course, this became crucial, and we saw this repeatedly in the interviews when change management became more important. This was a signal to avoid letting the minutia of managing change keep you from walking around as the commander. Another topic that took on huge significance as we worked through the interviews and looked at the data was the issue of transparency. This was so big it tended to encompass a lot of the other subjects. Especially, you'll note the 5 that we have listed here. When commanders failed at one of these other tasks, in their comments, they often pinpointed the cause of the failure to a lack of transparency. That was a huge finding. The meaning here seems clear then. Don't expect other leadership behaviors to help you demonstrate that transparency, right? Work directly on being more transparent first, up front. What policies and what approaches are you going to take with your personnel to show that transparency immediately and directly, as much as possible as part of your leadership style? The transparency will then add power to your other actions on multiple levels. The key learning here, rather than simply focusing on building trust and letting that show up as transparency, is to use transparency to create that trust. Okay, commanders also revealed in the interviews the effects of the amount of personnel had under them and what that did to their leadership. Jason addressed this in his comments. What adds to the challenges of squadron size was the number of problems it can create, according to these commanders, and the fact that the size of the squadron is usually beyond your control as the commander, right? Larger squadrons disrupted communication and supervision and frayed relationships among personnel. Even more significant, the data suggested some commanders tended to ignore the size issue and prioritize other concerns as if the sheer number of personnel and the geographic spread of their subunits was not a top-notch concern. When they did this, other problems grew in scale and importance, and we have that testimony in their interviews. Unit cohesion decreased as well. Findings on the topic of communication appear to be the most significant of all. Effective use of leadership by walking around, already addressed. Dealing effectively with the problem of the size of the squadron hinged in the data on using communication properly. A clearly articulated and a reasonable open-door policy as an opportunity showed itself as valuable. Jason said that. Commanders often praised its value in achieving better unit results, even when used less by subordinates, simply the fact of the policy. Okay, the biggest learning point on communication I'm going to save for the conclusion slide. The interviews pointed heavily towards commanders needing to take role awareness seriously. This can be kind of taken for granted. It's one of the things that in my military experience often got put aside, and then it became important when it was identified as a problem, which frankly the commanders revealed in their interviews was too late. Disconnectedness of personnel from the mission and the larger units that their squadron is under came up repeatedly. A special note here has to do with change management. We've seen that repeatedly in the data. Change management, when mishandled, was frequently attributed by these commanders, in retrospect, as a failure on this issue of role awareness. Airmen that did not appreciate their role responded especially negatively to change, and commanders had to work constantly uphill against that resistance. All right, the next topic, empowering airmen. Empowering them with decision power and resources. This task aided these commanders in change management, as you can see here, on a host of other fronts as well. This key finding showed up inside the leadership category or theme, where commanders were pointing to a battle they said they faced between strategic focus and merely fighting fires. So what these commanders repeatedly testified to is that when they failed to manage change well, or when employee relations or performance slipped, the cause was a failure to first seek to empower airmen, to empower them before a crisis through dedicated actions to restructure the work to enhance this empowerment, allow it to build up, was the key to their success. I'm going to leave you with two, we hope, valuable conclusions before Major Newcomer wraps this up. So please consider first our mental map of nodes, which you'll see again in ASPJ coming out in the spring. Think of them as levers for commanders to push, some more valuable and time effective than others. For example, the research so far suggests that transparency and empowering airmen are fundamental to success at the squadron level. To be overtaken by events, to shift too much attention away from these 2 points, at least in the eyes of these 30 commanders, brings too steep a price down the road. The multinodal ties, where you saw multiple outcomes affected by one input, that suggests that commanders can solve multiple problems by focusing improvement on one track. Sounds like a great thing to take advantage of. I promised there was one last topic on communication, so we'll get to that now. This needs more investigating, but the interviews indicated that communication is best thought of as the basis of both relationships and command itself. It's been pointed out in the past that topics like leadership or even education are misunderstood this way. We see it as a subject, but not as a method. And that's what I'm getting at here. In the same way, leaders can tend to misunderstand communication's centrality by seeing it as simply another element of their leadership or command, rather than the medium through which leadership occurs. Leadership, best understood, right, is not a purely mental event. We don't think leadership. We have to interact with people. We have to take action, and that requires communication, the medium of leadership. The bottom line here is the mistake that commanders can make when they assume that the quality of communication in the unit and the quality of communication from themselves is merely another function or attribute that they might want to work on, a subset of leadership. Instead, consider the idea that communication is leadership. At least that's what we saw in these interviews. So consider, if you will, why this is important. Communication can be consciously improved before a crisis hits. When the crisis hits, that level and quality of communication is always a powerful predictor of the outcome of any crisis. And one last piece of anecdotal evidence. I know our time has arrived, but one commander in the interviews noted that it took him about a year to work out his blind spots in command, and then that after that time period of that first year of command, he was able to be more effective. Ladies and gentlemen, let's work on those blind spots now, right? We all have them. Now is your chance. For those of you who've graduated, you can see maybe the benefit of this in retrospect. You might command again. For those of you facing command, take it seriously. And Jason, back over to you.
Right, and you just roll it up. So this is the last slide. Here's my email address. I'm on LinkedIn also under Jason Newcomer if you'd like to connect. I'll put up the research on LinkedIn. It will be out in the Air and Space Power Journal. There's so much information. I'll tell you what, I really appreciate, for those that are graduated commanders, last year, all the commanders that sat down with me and did the hour-and-a-half interviews, it was amazing that they shared so much time and so much heart to make sure that not only me, but everybody that's going to get this, which is all of you and everybody that reads a journal article, can benefit from their experience. Because how often do we say, wow, I wish I knew that sooner? A lot of folks complain that the Squadron Commander's course doesn't focus on skills you need as a commander, that it focuses on administrative things, the SAPR training and all that other stuff that's important, but doesn't necessarily prepare you to lead a unit of people. And so these things are experiences that worked for graduated commanders and things, practical application pieces that you can take with you and walk out today. So I hope that you found some kind of value in our research, and I'm really excited about it coming out, and I hope you read it. Thank you for your time.
Just a quick reminder, in about 15 minutes we'll have the live music set up, so please go grab some food and return back to Wood.